What I'd like to do is speak in broad terms about a range of issues, and then more specifically come to the question of the so-called Pacific solution, the Menadue solution, and what the coalition has been talking about in terms of a possible refugee policy for the future. But even before I start that, if I could do a little commercial, the best summary of refugee issues, history, prospects, policy changes is in this booklet, A New Approach Breaking the Stalemate to Refugees and Asylum Seekers, produced by the Centre for Policy Development. I was involved in writing it, so I would say it's that good, wouldn't I? A bit like Mandy Rice Davies, he would say that. But if you would like to look at it, I think there are copies out there. If you can make a donation, it would help the work that we're doing in respect of refugees. Anything from 1 cent to $10 would be very welcome, and that will provide the background to much of what I have to say this evening. A few facts about refugees. The 1951 Convention on Refugees has been signed and ratified together with the 1967 Protocol by over 147 countries. Not many of them in our region, however, have signed it. The 51 Convention was restricted to Europe. The Protocol of 67 extended the Refugee Convention worldwide, which set out various protections for refugees around the world. It's interesting that the major countries of the world that contribute and assist asylum seekers and refugees are the developing, the poor countries of the world, not developed countries like Australia or the United States. Pakistan, which has not signed the convention, which is very poor, has 1.9 million refugees. Yemen, which has signed the convention, last year took 100,000 boat people that came across the Red Sea. A remarkably generous response for one of the poorest countries in the world. So the poor are the real contributors and people who assist refugees around the world. It is important to be clear about the distinction between the asylum seeker and the refugee. Every refugee is at some stage an asylum seeker. They flee their country, come to Australia or elsewhere, and they seek refugee status. And until that refugee status is determined by the UNHCR or their host country, they remain asylum seekers. Then, when they are granted refugee status as acceptance, they then become refugees. The two terms are often used quite variously and in a confused way. There are, as I said, there are very few asylum seeker, there are very few refugee convention countries in our region. In the arc from Yemen to Australia, there is not one country that has signed the convention. And they're the countries on which we have to rely if we're going to have regional cooperation and satisfactory arrangements. The refugees to Australia, we've had 750,000 of them since the last war. It really has been a success story. Every new group, whether they're migrants or refugees, has had difficulties. The hostility, I think we all have to foreigners, the person's different, it's there. But with experience and working through our problems, whether they're Germans in South Australia, whether they're Irish Catholics, whether they're Jews, whether they're Refos, Balts, Indo-Chinese, now Muslims, each of them has had a problem when they've come to this country. But I think we have a proud record that we've worked our way through it. We're in the midst of a toxic debate at the present time, but I'm still optimistic that we can find a way through this impasse at the present time. Refugees are remarkable settlers. 750,000 of them, and it's not just the high-profile people that we hear about, the Frank Lowies and the Andos and others. It's the hundreds of thousands of refugee families that settle in this country, their families, they educate their children, they get jobs, but above all else they are highly motivated. They may have difficulties to begin with in terms of jobs, recognition and language, but they have the one thing which made them refugees in the first place: motivation. And that's why they take risks, and that's why they turn out to be great settlers in Australia, and particularly the second generation, the educational results of their children, lower unemployment records, higher rates of citizenship than the community, risk takers, entrepreneurs who work in country areas. It is a great success story. So I think we need to keep that very much in mind. One of the problems at the present time, of course, is enormous misinformation about refugees, and the government has simply failed to attempt or to win the case for factual information in the community on which good decisions can be made. I think it was Senator Daniel Moynihan said that, the late Senator, that everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but no one is entitled to their own facts. And we have a lot of instances in Australia now where opinions are put across as fact. For example, Tony Abbott, the last election, said we were being invaded by boat people. But in fact, only 1% of our migrant intake, in fact, are boat people. 76% of asylum seekers who come to this country come by air. But all the debate in this country is about boat people. We lock up boat people, but we don't lock up asylum seekers who come by air, a much larger number. The number of asylum seekers coming to this country, 6,000 to 7,000 a year, is minuscule compared to the hundreds of thousands that pour across out of the Mediterranean, particularly in recent years into northern Europe. We do not have a factual base for a sensible discussion about refugees and asylum seekers in this country. In this document that I hope you'll take away and consider, we set out various proposals for change of policy. I'll just mention a few of them. The Migration Act, we believe, should be amended so that it gets a proper balance between border security, which it emphasises in spades, and the humanitarian interests and requirements that we should express for refugees. The Department of Immigration, I know from experience, its centre of gravity is very much in favour of border protection rather than humanitarian policies, and for that reason we've recommended a separate authority responsible for refugee policy and implementation in Australia and outside the department in the way the Canadians do. We suggest that our refugee intake should be increased. Presently, the numbers are about something over 14,000. However, 7,000 of that is made up of onshore arrivals, which are then deducted from the overseas, from the total number, and there's about another 1,000 which are in effect family reunion. So in fact there's only about 7,000 of that 14,000 of that target, that program, which are in fact offshore refugees coming to this country from around the world. If we had the same refugee intake that we had under the Fraser government, we'd now be taking 30,000 refugees offshore and not 7,000 at the present time. We propose in those papers that we should have an orderly departure program with Afghanistan. We had a similar program with Vietnam after many refugees had come to this country. They were still going by boat, making risky journeys, so the Fraser government established an orderly departure program whereby about 100,000 refugees or families came, not refugees, families came from Vietnam. And they avoided the necessary for risky journeys to this country. We should do the same with Afghanistan at the present time. We should particularly increase the numbers of refugees we're taking out of Pakistan. There are large numbers of Hazara that have fled Afghanistan, and they are in daily threats to their life, being Hazara, confronted by fundamentalist Muslims in that northwestern Quetta part of Pakistan. We believe also, we recommend here, that we should have in-country processing in Sri Lanka and also maybe in Iran, with the approval of those governments. Under the Fraser government, we established in-country processing in, would you believe it, El Salvador and Chile, and we took about 6,000 people out of those countries with the agreement of those military governments. I think the reason why those military governments agreed is they wanted to get their political opponents out of the country. And one of the persons that came from, at that period, from Chile was Allende's daughter, who was taken to Australia, but she went back into politics in Chile. But there are important reasons and there are good precedents why we should be processing in-country so as to discourage people from taking risky journeys by air and more particularly by boat. And we should do the same for Sri Lanka. Tamils are still under great pressure in that country. The government of Sri Lanka will be glad to get rid of a lot of their Tamil opposition. And I believe the Sri Lankan government would cooperate with Australia quietly. Not that they wouldn't be refugees, of course, because they'd still be in country, but suffering discrimination and might come to Australia. We propose in here, in this policy statement, that we need to develop regional cooperation. An important reason why the Fraser government was so successful in the Indochina program, resettlement in Australia, was that the countries of the region, particularly Malaysia, Thailand and Indonesia, they took in total and others 1.4 million Indo-Chinese asylum seekers who then became refugees. And because they were given temporary protection in those transit countries in our region, they were then processed and came on to Australia, Canada, United States, France. Until we establish an effective regional program, we are not going to solve the so-called problem that we have at the present time. It depends on regional cooperation. One thing I learned from those that time with Malcolm Fraser, the less regional countries cooperate in our refugee settlement programs, we're going to have this continuing problem that we have at the present time. We also recommend the end of mandatory detention. Our proposition is that mandatory detention should be the exception. The basic presumption should be that no asylum seeker is held in detention beyond a certain period unless there are good reasons of security, health or otherwise to keep that person in detention. And what we are doing in Australia in mandatory detention, in my view, is a clear breach of the convention that we have signed to provide protection to asylum seekers and refugees. In fact, we are punishing them. Now that's, if you like, some of the broad aspects of policy that we're outlined here. If I could, I'd like to speak particularly tonight on the question of, in relation to regional cooperation, what we've been hearing about Nauru, the Pacific solution, the one-liners and the slogans, excuse me, being personal from Tony Abbott, turn the back to Indonesia, stop the boats, take the boat clear to Nauru. And the proposition I put to you tonight is that that policy failed in the past and will fail in the future, and that what the coalition is offering will not succeed and will be disastrous for this country and will be very costly. In pointing out the Pacific solution, so-called, by Tony Abbott, he refers to the success of the Howard government in stopping boat leaving. And it's true that the Howard policies did stop the boats. There's not much doubt about that. But they continue to come by air. And about 4,000 continue to come through those early periods after 2001 with the Howard government. If one mode of arrival is made more difficult, people come another way. People smugglers work with both boat arrivals and air arrivals. So what is important is not how people arrive by boat, but in fact the total number of arrivals. And I have distributed, and I hope you've got it, I don't know whether you have there, there are a couple of, you've got anything that looks like that? If I just, if you can find a colleague or someone to have a look at that. The first one is Australia versus OECD asylum flows. This is total asylum flows, not boats, not air, so this was total. And you'll see from that the trend, the flows of asylum seekers to Australia, which is the bottom black part, follows very closely the trend of OECD asylum flows. The pattern of asylum flows to this country was very similar to what happened in other OECD countries. And the number of asylum seekers fell dramatically after 2001, when Howard stopped the boats, and it fell for all other countries as well. The asylum seeker flow to Australia was the same trend as for Australia. Then, and as a result of new developments, the surge in Afghanistan, the civil war in Sri Lanka, the numbers started rising again after about 2006. And the same happened in Australia. What these figures show, and it's in better colourful diagrams in this booklet, is that the asylum seeker flows to Australia followed very closely the asylum seeker flows to other OECD countries. And what the Howard government did had minimal impact on that flow. The flows were driven by what was happening in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and Sri Lanka particularly. And that's what the back graph shows, is how those events, Afghanistan, Iraq, resulted in the peak in 2001, when the Howard policies were introduced, and fell away dramatically to about the mid-50s, and then they rose again, particularly as a result of the problems in Sri Lanka. The case, I think, is very clear that the Howard government policies did not succeed in making a significant difference to the flow of asylum seekers. We followed the same pattern as other OECD countries. And what we did this in had only a marginal impact. For those of you who are statisticians, mathematicians, I think one of the great fallacies is because two things happen at the same time, you think there's a causal relationship between them. And these figures, I think, show quite conclusively that the decline in numbers to Australia after 2001 and the Howard years had very little to do with Howard policies, and the numbers rose again after 2004-05 as a result of events offshore rather than what happened in Australia. As I mentioned earlier, we have this preoccupation with opium, and that's why I think we have this skewed debate in Australia rather than the fictional debate about total asylum numbers. It's interesting that the coalition very rarely, if ever, refers to the asylum seekers who come by air. If I could quote an example, on the 10th of December in 2010, the Sydney Morning Herald reported from WikiLeaks that a key Liberal Party strategist told a US diplomat in Canberra in November last year, that's 2009, that the issue of asylum seekers was fantastic for the coalition, and the more boats that came, the better. And that cynicism, I think, is reflected in the preoccupation we have with boats, the exaggeration we have about boats coming to Australia. That's what the debate is about. It's a political debate about boats and very little about a wider policy issue. But coming back specifically to Nauru, Tony Abbott has said that if he's elected Prime Minister, he'll go on the phone next day to the President of Nauru wanting to establish processing centre. In fact, it's a prison in Nauru. He should remind himself that the previous attempt for 5 years when Nauru was opened before under the Howard government, it cost over $1 billion over 5 years. It would probably cost double that at the present time. Furthermore, in Nauru, despite the very cruel punishment of asylum seekers who were transferred off the Tampa and elsewhere to Nauru, 97% of them who were found to be refugees finished up in either Australia or New Zealand. The so-called Nauru solution didn't work in terms of deferring people. And everyone who has knowledge of what happened last time will know that if the government, coalition government, sends you to Nauru, there's a 90% chance you'll finish up in Australia anyhow. It will not be a deterrent. But furthermore, even if there was some marginal benefit out of the Nauru proposal and sending people from Tampa and subsequently to Nauru, it is very clear from the Department of Immigration and Citizenship that it will not work again. And the Secretary of the Department spelled out in the Senate committee last November that Nauru might have worked marginally in the first instance, but it would not work in the future. But he said, and I quote, "Dramatic, high-profile efforts meeting Tampa, together with the processing that occurred on Nauru, was very much unknown to people at the time. The people who were subject to it, the people smugglers who were organising it, were not able to predict what would occur. A point that I, the Secretary of the Department, have often made is that what was known prior to the events of 2001 became known in hindsight. It became a certainty that they would finish up in Australia and New Zealand. The key point is that Nauru cannot be replicated in the future." So I think it's pretty clear that it didn't work in the past. It was even less likely it would work in the future. One other disadvantage of Nauru, which the coalition espouses, is that Nauru cannot be part of any regional solution. Nauru is out in the Pacific. It is not a transit country, and if we are to build a regional cooperation arrangement for the management of asylum flows in our region, it must be with transit countries like Malaysia, Thailand and Indonesia. Nauru has nothing to contribute to those transit regional arrangements. So for that ground, also I suggest that Nauru, unlike Malaysia, has nothing to offer in terms of a regional arrangement that would be beneficial to asylum seekers as well as to Australia. Another part of Tony Abbott's Pacific solution is the issue of temporary protection visas for persons who are found to be refugees. You might recall that one feature of these temporary protection visas is that the holder cannot sponsor family members to join him or her in Australia. And that is why when CIVX sank off Indonesia 10 years ago with a loss of 353 lives, 288, or 82%, were women and children. That is, a member of their family, largely a male, who've got a temporary protection visa in Australia, could not sponsor them to join him in Australia, so they decided to risk it themselves by boat. And that's why 82% of CIVX, which sank, and why 288 women and children were drowned, was because of temporary protection visas. I think any reasonable person would conclude that temporary protection visas are not a humane policy for this country to pursue. Another element of the coalition policy on asylum seekers, the one-liners and the slogans, is that the Abbott government would push back boats into Indonesian waters. The Fraser government in July 1979, in a cabinet submission, considered that option of turning boats around at sea, and it concluded that Australia would be courting international pariah status if it attempted to do that. And the same would be true today, and the Indonesian government has made it clear, and will probably make it even clearer in the future, that turning boats destined for Australia back to Indonesia would not be acceptable, and neither should we regard it as acceptable. Furthermore, in the Senate in November last year, Admiral Ray Griggs of the RAN said that turning boats around at sea was highly risky, both for naval personnel and for the asylum seekers, and that naval personnel would be bound by the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, and that convention would be the main driver of what RAN personnel would do if they encountered floundering vessels and vessels that the government had said must be returned to Indonesian waters. I guess what I'm saying is that it may sound partisan, but I've been very critical of the government's policy for the lack of courage on this whole issue of asylum seekers, is that the coalition policy is flimsy, it is one-liners, it is slogans, and it won't work. But the opposition still continues. The High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, who was here in Australia only about a month ago, I suggest must have had the coalition in mind when he said in Sydney on the 14th of February this year that we, that is Australians, should avoid simplistic or populist explanation for what are very complex, multi-dimensional issues. Fears about projected floods of refugees, industrial countries are often vastly overblown. The debate in Australia, he said, is out of all proportion in relation to the real dimensions and the number of people coming to Australia, about 6,000 asylum seekers per annum. He said they are small by global standards. We need a sense of balance, perspective and compassion for those who are less fortunate. And that is sadly lacking in the debate at the present time, a sense of compassion and balance for what is a very small problem indeed in terms of the total numbers of refugees around the world. 10 million under the direct control, direction of the United Nations High Commissioner, 5 million under the control and direction of the Palestinian Commissioner, and there are another 30 million people of concern of the UNHCR who are displaced outside their borders or within their country, are not seeking refugee status, but are of major concern to the UNHCR. That's the dimension of the problem, and we're having a blue fit in this country, about 6,000 boat people. A couple of examples of these one-liners we've had recently. Forgive me for being partisan, but I feel very angry about what's been happening. Scott Morrison recently attacked the government for the minimal accommodation support for asylum seekers living in the community. You may have seen the story in the Daily Telegraph about the luxurious conditions which asylum seeking community would have at their disposal: television sets, Blu-ray, all the rest. A grossly disturbing story, and Scott Morrison's onto that once again, pointing out how hard-working Australians, blue-collar Australians, would resent this privilege and priority being given for asylum seekers living in the community. And for those that know asylum seekers living in the community will know that is just not true. They are doing it very badly indeed. And more recently, only last week, Scott Morrison gave us another dose of xenophobia. He said, typhoid cases on the latest boats highlight the risk of Labor's border failures. Asylum seekers will bring diseases to this country. I don't know I've heard of a scurrilous attack on that from the coalition. It is difficult to get anything lower than that, which I think is clearly untrue and has been refuted by people who have expertise in infectious diseases. As I said, we have, I believe, a quite toxic debate in this country, made worse by the nature of the victimisation of some of the most defenceless and vulnerable people in the world. It is the easiest thing for unscrupulous people to pillory, victimise the foreigner, the outsider, the person that's different. And that's what the campaign against asylum seekers is really about today in this country. In some senses also, I think the debate and the attacks on asylum seekers are a proxy for a debate about race. That we have formally abolished white Australia, but there are still elements in this community who respond to issues of race. Taking the form more recently, not so much of race but religion, and particularly Muslims who are coming into this country. But in fact, only about 27% of asylum seekers and refugees who became refugees in Australia in 2010 were Muslims. Only 27%. The majority were Christians, mainly from the Middle East, where they're under a great deal of pressure. But the schoolyard bullying of very defenceless, very vulnerable people is, I think, a sorry state for Australia. I think we're a better country than that. But there is a great tempting opportunity for unscrupulous people to appeal to the darker angels of our nature, whereas Malcolm Fraser, I think, successfully appealed to the better angels of our nature, and then we grudgingly responded. And we can look back now at the resettlement of Indo-Chinese refugees in this country as a great success story. I think we can be very proud of what we did. I believe that in the end we'll get through this problem, but it's pretty grim at the moment. Well, I do think there are some signs of change, and the government decision to introduce bridging visas to get asylum seekers progressively out of detention is an encouraging development. The problem with asylum seekers coming to Australia is minimal. It's exaggerated, out of all proportion. The one-liners and the slogans is clearly not a solution, and more particularly, what I've said tonight, I hope I've been able to demonstrate that Nauru is not a solution. It was not a solution before, and will not be a solution in the future. Thank you very much. But I have no doubt that mandatory detention is a clear breach of Article 31 of the Refugee Convention. And that is also the view of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. They are usually very diplomatic and polite, because Australia in many respects is a good supporter of the UNHCR in terms of money and in terms of resettlement places, but they are under no doubt that we are in clear breach of the Convention. We are, under the Convention, we are not to punish people for seeking asylum and protection. And that's what we are doing.
So why are they doing it then? Why are they allowed to do it?
Well, because our government has, the Labor government, introduced mandatory detention back in the Hawke period, and has not, despite its comments it's going to phase it out, it has not done so. And the opposition follows them. I think it's a straight political question that both major parties, or three major parties, believe that being cruel and hostile and punishing asylum seekers is good politics. That's its sword, is that, in my view.
Sorry, I don't want to go on, but the convention itself then is too weak. The UN cannot just say you can't do this and that's it.
No, it's left to individual countries, and the matter has not been tested in the High Court. And And after the decision on Malaysia, I would not have great confidence in the High Court on that one either, but that's another question. Countries that do it well, I think the Canadians do it well, in terms of their legislation, in terms of their acceptance of full resettlement, the way they treat asylum seekers. They do not deduct asylum seekers from the offshore quota, and they have good resettlement programs. The other countries which I think, as in most issues, do these things extraordinarily well are the Scandinavians. Sweden in particular takes about 30 or 40,000 asylum seekers each year. Small country, they have good welfare and infrastructure facilities. They do it extremely well. Australia did it well under the Fraser government. It really did it well. And we should be proud of what we did then, but we're not doing it now. I think it is clear hypocrisy. We send Australian troops to die in Afghanistan, formerly in Iraq, to free them from the Taliban and other insurgent groups. And when the same people in those countries flee the Taliban and seek protection in Australia, we refuse them or vilify them. Clearly, enormous hypocrisy in what we're doing. Mentioning the Fraser government again, one reason that Malcolm Fraser gave for the generous leadership that we provided in this country was that Australia had fought in Vietnam. We had contributed willy-nilly to some of the great devastation and killing in that country, and therefore we had a moral responsibility to accept, as it turned out, large numbers of Vietnamese and Indo-Chinese into this country. The same argument, unfortunately, is not being applied in respect to Afghanistan and Iraq. The numbers in detention are quite large by historical standards. It's 5,000 plus. My view and our view is that when you have that sort of number, particularly in isolated parts of Australia, it's hard to get services and support to them. It's going to take time to process them, and it'd be much better if they were very largely processed in the community, as we do for air arrivals. So it's a larger number than we've had before. I think Serco is a particular problem. The contractor who is responsible for servicing in the detention centres. I think the major problem, and a particularly acute problem, is security checks. I had dealings with ASIO when I was in the department, and I left the department very unhappy with the performance of ASIO as to their honesty and their competence. And I have not changed my mind since. They are very slow. They refuse to disclose the reasons, even in the broadest terms, for refusing or recommending that asylum seekers and refugees are accepted into this country. ASIO is a major problem, not only in terms of justice, but in terms of the delays that you've mentioned. If I could just perhaps give an example, it's something a bit out of date, but it's an example of what happens. When I was Secretary of the Department, we had a Japanese academic who applied for entry into the ANU to take on a fellowship for 3 or 6 months, he and his wife. The recommendation from ASIO was that he be refused a visa because he had associations with the Japanese Red Army. This is all public knowledge subsequent, so I'm not disclosing anything publicly for the first time. Ian McPhee accepted the recommendation of ASIO. We refused him a visa, and I supported that decision. And the newspapers carried on a major campaign. Academics, not surprisingly, said denial of freedom, academic freedom and so on. And it went on for about 6 months. But the minister publicly defended a decision not to grant the visa. About 6 months, the Director General of ASIO came to see me and he said, John, he said, I you see that you and your minister have been copping a lot of flack over this recommendation of ours. And he said, would you like me to change the recommendation? And he did. ASIO is hit and miss. They rely on the Brits and the Americans for assessments. How do you really, if you're outside those countries, how do you get a reliable security assessment out of the security services in Iraq, the Savak, Afghanistan, Iraq, Sri Lanka? It is hit and miss. And there is no appeal against what I think is often the incompetence of ASIO. That issue needs immediate attention, in my view, and is a significant factor in the delays and in some cases the suicide of young men who have been granted refugee status and then refused permanent residence on the ground of a security check, which they've never been able to see or to contest. Assumptions are often made, and Sri Lankans are a particular problem with ASIO. They're very worried about Tamil Tigers. Just because a person is a Tamil Tiger in the culture and environment of Sri Lanka does not mean, in my view, they are automatically a threat in this country. The IRA, active and violent in their own country, many of them migrated and became good citizens. And I think, unfortunately, there is a view that just because you've got the tag of a Tamil Tiger, you're dangerous and should be excluded. ASIO is a major problem for us. I cannot really say that I've followed that closely, except a general comment that the countries of Africa, despite their poverty, are showing a generosity to refugees that we do not show in this country. Poor people are extraordinarily generous. Maybe that is a feature of refugee situations around the world, but the poor are the most humane in helping others in need, and the richest, such as Australia, are the most critical and the most unhelpful. I think we need to take more from Africa, but we depend very largely on the UNHCR. I happen to think that to solve our political problem, and it is a political problem, not a policy problem, we need a regional solution, that's why I've concentrated so much on Thailand, Malaysia and Indonesia. That's where the focus of our whole range of policies needs to be, including refugee policies. The High Court decision was basically that there were no domestic or international laws that could be enforced in Malaysia that would protect asylum seekers. That's what it came down to. I think it was a very unfortunate decision. And I'm a little bit on my own in supporting the Malaysian approach. If we didn't have a political problem for this toxic debate, I wouldn't be a supporter. But I see the Malaysian proposal agreement as a way to resolve some of these dreadful political problems we have locally at the moment. Then we can move to more substantial reform, including mandatory detention in Australia. The other reason why I support the Malaysian agreement was that it's a building block for a regional settlement, and we will not have any lasting satisfactory arrangement without a regional settlement which includes Malaysia. I'm a bit on my own on that one. The negotiations which the Australian government concluded with Malaysia, and which was given a tick by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, was, I think, great progress, although it's now lapsed very largely. For the first time, Malaysia, that is not a signatory to the convention, undertook to make a distinction between illegal migrants and asylum seekers. First time ever. The Malaysian government agreed that together with the UNHCR they would register asylum seekers in their country, and that they would not be subject to criminal prosecution or harassment by police. How they'd monitor that, and police, is another question. Asylum seekers under that arrangement would be able to work in Malaysia. They would not be detained. They would have some access for their children for education and for health services. They were very substantial. It was very substantial progress. Malaysia and ASEAN has committed itself to a human rights covenant. Australia's refused to do it. I think it's unfortunate that possible building block is now being cast aside. As I come back to what I said before, unless we have a regional arrangement, we're not going to get anywhere near satisfaction and sensible policies in our region. If we don't get that, we'll continue with this present toxic debate about voting, which will really paralyse any sensible policy movement. Not in the way proposed with Malaysia. The 1989 Executive Council resolution of UNHCR stated that offshore processing of the Malaysian type, well before that, was acceptable, subject to certain safeguards. My own view, as you probably heard, is that we should process here. The numbers are so small that I believe we've got to address this political problem that's being inflicted upon us. I don't think it really matters where the processing occurs, as long as it's just, as long as it's efficient. And I think that Malaysian approach was a very encouraging development. But I'm on my back alone on that one. I should mention, in respect of asylum seekers and ASIO reports, I think we may see some progress in that in the near future, that some arrangement for appeal, appropriate arrangement for safeguard security, will make it possible for asylum seekers subject to adverse security reports to have their appeals be held and heard by the appropriate tribunal. I think that's going to come fairly soon.